In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. What is spoken of, often in whispers, sometimes in ledgers, is belonging. Who is welcomed? Who is remembered? And who is quietly erased without explanation? In such circles, an invitation is not merely paper and ink. It is permission. It is survival. And on the evening when the most exclusive guest list of the season was finalized, one woman discovered she had been excluded, not by accident, but by decision. She did not protest. She did not plead. She did not ask why her name was missing. Because in her world, one does not question absence. One simply learns to endure it. What she did not know was that someone else was reading the same list. And when the Duke paused, just long enough for the room to still, society would learn a dangerous truth. Real power does not argue. It edits. Before this story continues, if you've ever been the one left off a list, the one who learned too late that silence can be deliberate, then you already know how this feels. Stories like this are often watched quietly, and forgotten just as quietly. But if you stay, if you listen to the end, then do not disappear as she once did. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I will read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Let this channel remember that you were here. The invitations arrived on a Tuesday. Adelaide Morland knew this not because hers had come, but because Mrs. Pemberton mentioned it at breakfast. Then Lady Ashford referenced it during their walk through the park. By tea time, even Miss Cartwright, who rarely attended anything, had received the cream-coloured envelope with the Duchess of Harrington's seal pressed into burgundy wax. Adelaide smiled at each mention. She inquired politely about the details. She expressed appropriate enthusiasm for an event she assumed, with quiet certainty, would include her. After all, she had attended the Harrington summer garden party. She had been invited to the Dowager Countess's musicale just last month. Her name appeared on guest lists with enough regularity that its absence would be noteworthy. Surely it would be noteworthy. By Wednesday afternoon, Adelaide began checking the hall table with a frequency she found embarrassing. The silver tray where correspondence was placed sat beside the entrance like a small altar of social judgment. Each time she passed, she glanced down with studied casualness, as though she might be looking for anything at all. Thursday brought a letter from her cousin in Bath. A tradesman's bill. An advertisement for a new milliner on Bond Street. No burgundy wax. She told herself the post had been delayed. London was unpredictable that way. Perhaps the Duchess's secretary had been overwhelmed by the volume of invitations and hers had simply been mislaid in the shuffle. These things happened. They happened to other people, certainly. By Friday, the waiting had taken on a different texture. It was no longer expectation. It was something closer to dread, though Adelaide would not have named it as such. To name it would require acknowledging that there was something to dread, and she had not yet admitted, even privately, that the invitation might not come at all. When Lady Ashford stopped by for tea that afternoon, Adelaide prepared herself. "I've been meaning to ask," Lady Ashford said, settling into the chair by the window with the ease of old friendship, "what are you planning to wear to the Harrington ball?" "I'm utterly at a loss. The modiste showed me 3 designs and I loathe them all." Adelaide's hands stilled on the teapot. There it was. The assumption. The natural, unthinking assumption that of course Adelaide had been invited, because why wouldn't she be? The question was not whether she would attend, but what she would wear when she did. "I haven't decided yet," Adelaide said, and was grateful her voice emerged steady. It was not a lie. One could not decide what one would wear to an event one might not attend. The statement was technically accurate, and Adelaide had learned long ago that technical accuracy was a form of self-protection. Lady Ashford launched into a detailed critique of sleeve styles and the challenges of finding ribbon in the exact shade of rose she required. Adelaide listened with the appearance of interest, nodding at appropriate intervals, while her mind performed rapid calculations. Had Lady Ashford seen her invitation arrive? No, she had only just asked what Adelaide planned to wear, which meant she assumed the invitation existed but had not personally witnessed its delivery. Which meant Adelaide could still wait. She could wait until Monday. Perhaps Tuesday. She could wait until the very last polite moment before she would be forced to acknowledge, aloud, to another person, that she had not been invited at all. "You've gone quiet," Lady Ashford observed, setting down her teacup. "Are you well?" "Perfectly," Adelaide said. "Only wool gathering. Forgive me." Lady Ashford smiled, reassured, and returned to the subject of her impossible modiste. That evening, Adelaide stood before her wardrobe and considered the gowns hanging there in silent judgment. She had 3 that might be suitable for a ball of this importance. The pale blue silk with the embroidered hem. The ivory satin she had worn only once. The rose-colored muslin that made her complexion look less sallow than it often did in candlelight. She ran her fingers across the blue silk. It was foolish to even consider it. Foolish to imagine which gown she might wear, which gloves, which ribbon for her hair. She had not been invited. The evidence was now overwhelming. The invitations had been sent nearly a week ago, and hers had not arrived because it had not been sent. And yet, her hand lingered on the fabric. She could not bring herself to close the wardrobe door. By Sunday, the silence had become its own form of communication. Adelaide had not received her invitation, and she had begun to understand, slowly, the way one understands the approach of winter, that she would not. At church, she saw the Duchess of Harrington from a distance. The woman was surrounded, as always, by a small constellation of admirers and petitioners. Adelaide did not approach. To approach would be to invite a conversation she could not afford to have. What would she say? "I notice I have not received my invitation." No. One did not say such things. One did not draw attention to an exclusion, because to do so was to suggest one had expected inclusion. And to expect inclusion was to reveal a misunderstanding of one's own position. Adelaide had not misunderstood. Or perhaps she had, and this was the correction. She returned home as the afternoon light slanted through the windows of her drawing-room, turning everything golden and transient. She sat in the chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap and did not move for a very long time. The invitation was not coming. She knew this now with the flat, certain knowledge of fact. What she did not yet know was what it meant. Whether it was an oversight, unlikely but possible. Whether it was a message, more likely, but about what? Whether it was simply the way things were, and she had been naive to think otherwise. The hall clock chimed 6. Adelaide rose, smoothed her skirts, and went upstairs to dress for a quiet dinner alone. She did not look at the wardrobe. She did not think about blue silk or ivory satin, or the exact shade of rose that might make her look less invisible than she had apparently become. She dressed in grey, because grey required no decisions. And when her maid asked if she needed anything else, Adelaide smiled and said no, she had everything she required. It was not, technically, a lie. The confirmation came on Monday afternoon, in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room, in front of 7 witnesses. Adelaide had not wanted to attend the tea. She had invented 3 separate excuses throughout the morning, each one reasonable enough to deploy. A headache. A prior commitment she had forgotten. A letter that required immediate attention. But to suddenly withdraw from social engagements, to become conspicuously absent, would itself be a form of communication. It would suggest she knew something. That she was hiding. And Adelaide Morland did not hide. So she had dressed in her afternoon gown of soft lavender, arranged her hair with particular care, and arrived at Lady Pemberton's townhouse at precisely 4 o'clock with a composure that had taken considerable effort to manufacture. The drawing-room was already full. Mrs. Dalton sat near the fire, holding court about her daughter's upcoming presentation. Miss Cartwright and her sister occupied the settee by the window, speaking in low tones about something that made them both smile. Lady Ashford waved from across the room, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. And there, standing near the tea service with a cup balanced elegantly in her gloved hand, was Lady Henrietta Crowe. Adelaide felt something tighten in her chest. Lady Crowe was not merely a guest. She was the Duchess of Harrington's closest companion, her most trusted confidant, and, most relevantly, the woman who had personally overseen the guest list for the ball. If anyone knew why Adelaide's invitation had not arrived, it was her. Their eyes met across the room. Lady Crow smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was perhaps the worst part. It was warm, welcoming, utterly devoid of malice. The smile of a woman who had nothing to hide and no reason for discomfort. "Miss Morland," Lady Crow said, crossing the room with her teacup still perfectly level. "How lovely to see you. I was hoping we might have a moment to speak." The conversations around them did not stop, but they shifted. Voices dropped half a register. Attention, while not obvious, reoriented itself toward the two women now standing near the center of the room. Everyone was listening. "Of course," Adelaide said, matching Lady Crow's pleasant tone exactly. "I am at your disposal." Lady Crow's smile deepened, as though Adelaide had said something particularly gracious. She set down her teacup on a nearby table, a deliberate gesture that suggested this conversation would require both hands, or perhaps simply more time than a casual exchange allowed. "I wanted to speak with you about the Harrington Ball," Lady Crow began, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearest without being loud enough to seem intentional. "I know there has been some anticipation regarding the event." Adelaide's pulse was steady. Her expression remained open, interested, faintly curious. She had practiced this face in the mirror more times than she cared to count. "The Duchess has planned something truly spectacular," Adelaide said. "I'm certain it will be the event of the season." "Indeed," Lady Crow agreed, and there was something in her eyes now, not unkindness, but purpose. "Which is precisely why the guest list has been so carefully considered. The Duchess has been quite particular about the attendees this year. More so than usual." The room had gone quieter now. Mrs. Dalton's voice trailed off mid-sentence. Miss Cartwright set down her teacup with a faint clink of porcelain. Adelaide waited. Given the constraints of space, Lady Crow continued, her tone remaining pleasant, almost apologetic, and the rather significant number of individuals who expressed interest, the Duchess found it necessary to be selective. There it was. Not a direct statement. Not an outright declaration. Just a gentle arrangement of words that added up to a single, unmistakable conclusion. Adelaide had not been selected. "I understand completely," Adelaide said, and her voice did not waver. "These decisions are always difficult. I'm certain the Duchess has chosen wisely." Lady Crow's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine relief. "I'm so glad you understand." The Duchess was concerned, well, we were both concerned, that there might be some disappointment. "But you've always been so remarkably reasonable, Miss Morland. It's one of your most admirable qualities." The words landed like a compliment and a dismissal in the same breath. "You are reasonable. You will not make a scene. You will accept this gracefully because that is what reasonable people do." "The Duchess is too kind to worry on my account," Adelaide replied, and she meant it. The Duchess had likely not thought of her at all. It was Lady Crow who had removed her name from the list, Lady Crow who had made the decision, Lady Crow who now stood before her delivering the news with a warmth that made refusal seem like a form of mercy. "I knew you would see it that way," Lady Crow said, reaching out to touch Adelaide's hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity, of shared understanding between women who both knew how the world worked. "There will be other gatherings, of course. Smaller affairs. More intimate. Less important." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "I look forward to them," Adelaide said. Lady Crow smiled once more, squeezed Adelaide's hand gently, and then turned back toward the tea service as though they had merely been discussing the weather. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed. Mrs. Dalton picked up where she had left off. Miss Cartwright leaned toward her sister and whispered something that made them both glance briefly in Adelaide's direction before looking away. Lady Ashford caught Adelaide's eye from across the room, her expression a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty. She started to rise, as if to come over, but Adelaide shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Not now. Please, not now." Adelaide crossed to the tea service, poured herself a cup she did not want, and spent the next 40 minutes engaged in polite conversation about nothing of consequence. She laughed at appropriate moments. She expressed interest in topics that bored her. She did not leave early, because to leave early would suggest she had been affected. When she finally departed at 5:30, she walked to her carriage with her spine straight and her head level. She did not cry during the ride home. She did not cry when she entered her house and dismissed her maid. She did not cry when she climbed the stairs to her bedroom and closed the door behind her. She stood in front of the wardrobe and looked at the blue silk gown, the ivory satin, the rose-colored muslin. Then she closed the wardrobe door. She crossed to the writing desk by the window, sat down, and pulled out a sheet of paper. For several minutes she simply stared at the blank page, her pen motionless in her hand. Finally, she dipped the nib in ink and began to write. Dear Cousin Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been thinking lately about your invitation to visit you in Bath. She would leave London for a month. Perhaps 2. She would be gone during the ball, and when she returned, the season would have moved on to other scandals, other exclusions, other women who had been quietly informed they were not quite important enough. The letter took her less than 10 minutes to write. When it was finished, she folded it carefully, sealed it with wax, and set it on the corner of her desk to be posted in the morning. Then Adelaide Morland sat in the gathering darkness of her bedroom and did not move for a very long time. Outside, the city continued without her. Inside, she remained perfectly still. And if anyone had asked, though no one did, she would have said she was fine. She would have said it with a smile. She would have meant it, technically, because fine was a low enough bar that almost anyone could clear it, if they were willing to redefine what the word meant. The rumours began the morning after Lady Pemberton's tea. Adelaide did not hear them directly. No one repeated gossip to the subject of the gossip, that would be indelicate. But she felt them in the way Mrs. Dalton's smile faltered when they passed each other in the milliner's shop. She saw them in how Miss Cartwright's sister suddenly found the opposite side of the street fascinating during their usual morning walk through the park. By Wednesday, the invitations to smaller gatherings had slowed to a trickle. By Thursday, they had stopped entirely. Adelaide had expected this. Exclusion was not a singular event, it was a contagion. Those who associated too closely with the excluded risked becoming tainted by proximity. It was safer to simply step back, to let the distance grow naturally, without explanation, until the gap became too wide to cross. On Friday morning, Lady Ashford called. Adelaide heard the knock, heard her butler's quiet exchange with the visitor, and felt something tighten in her chest. She almost told him to say she was not receiving. But that would be a lie told aloud, and Adelaide had committed herself to technical truths, even when they were uncomfortable. "Show her in," Adelaide said. Lady Ashford entered the drawing-room with the careful energy of someone approaching a wounded animal. Her smile was bright, perhaps too bright, and she clutched her reticule with both hands as though it might escape. "Adelaide," she said warmly, "I've been meaning to call all week, but you know how time slips away." It had been 4 days since the tea at Lady Pemberton's. 4 days was not a week, but Adelaide did not correct her. "Please, sit," Adelaide said, gesturing to the chair opposite hers. "Tea?" "Oh, no, I can't stay long. I have 3 other calls to make this afternoon." Lady Ashford perched on the edge of the seat, her posture suggesting she might flee at any moment. "I simply wanted to see how you were. After Monday." There it was. The unspoken thing, hanging between them like fog. Adelaide folded her hands in her lap. "I'm quite well, thank you for asking." Lady Ashford's smile flickered. "Are you? Truly?" "Truly." A pause. Lady Ashford glanced toward the window, then back to Adelaide. "It's just that, well, everyone has been talking about it. About Lady Crow's conversation with you. And I thought perhaps you might want to discuss it with a friend." Adelaide considered her. Lady Ashford meant well. She had always meant well. But meaning well and being brave enough to act on it were not the same thing. "There's nothing to discuss," Adelaide said gently. "The Duchess's guest list is her own concern. I harbour no ill feelings about it. But surely you must have been surprised. Or disappointed. One cannot be disappointed by something one has no right to expect. The words came out more sharply than Adelaide had intended. Lady Ashford flinched slightly, and Adelaide softened her tone. I mean only that the ball is the Duchess's event, and she is entitled to invite whomever she chooses. It would be presumptuous of me to feel otherwise. Lady Ashford leaned forward, lowering her voice as though they might be overheard. But Adelaide, people are saying, she stopped herself. Saying what? Nothing. It's only gossip. You know how people are. Adelaide did know how people were. But she found, suddenly, that she wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Wanted to know what narrative was being constructed about her in drawing-rooms and tea-parlours across London. Please, Adelaide said. Tell me what they're saying. Lady Ashford looked genuinely pained. I don't want to repeat it. It's unkind. I would rather know. A long pause. Then, reluctantly, they're saying that perhaps there was a reason for the exclusion. That perhaps you had done something, or said something. That Lady Crow was acting on the Duchess's behalf to quietly correct a situation. Adelaide's expression did not change. I see. But I don't believe it, Lady Ashford added quickly. I told Mrs. Dalton as much yesterday. I said you would never do anything to warrant such treatment. That's very kind of you. So it's not true. There wasn't anything. And there it was. The real reason for the visit. Lady Ashford had not come to offer comfort. She had come to confirm whether the rumours had merit. To determine whether continuing their friendship might pose a risk to her own social standing. Adelaide could have lied. Could have invented some minor transgression, given Lady Ashford something to report back that would satisfy the gossips and make Adelaide's exclusion seem logical, deserved. But she found she had no interest in making anyone feel better about what had been done to her. There was nothing, Adelaide said clearly. I have done nothing wrong. I have said nothing offensive. The decision to exclude me was made for reasons I was not given, and I did not ask for them. Lady Ashford blinked. You didn't ask? No. But surely Lady Crow would have explained if you had pressed her. I did not press her. Why not? Because to press would be to beg. To demand an explanation would be to suggest she believed she deserved one. And in the world Adelaide inhabited, one did not demand. One accepted what was given and carried on with dignity. But she could not say this to Lady Ashford, who would not understand. I saw no point, Adelaide said instead. Lady Ashford stared at her as though she had said something in a foreign language. I don't understand. How can you just accept it? Without knowing why. Because knowing why would change nothing. It might make you feel better. Would it? Lady Ashford opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I suppose. I suppose I don't know. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a carriage rattled past. A bird called from somewhere in the garden. Finally, Lady Ashford stood. I should go. I really do have other calls. Of course. Lady Ashford hesitated at the door, one hand on the frame. She looked back at Adelaide with something that might have been sympathy or might have been relief that she was not the one sitting in that chair. Adelaide, if you need anything. I won't, Adelaide said gently. But thank you. After Lady Ashford left, Adelaide remained in her chair for a long time. She had told the truth. She did not know why she had been excluded. But she was beginning to understand something else. Her refusal to explain, to justify, to seek reasons, it unsettled people. They wanted her to be angry, or sad, or desperate to understand. They wanted a reaction that made sense, that fit the narrative they were constructing. Instead, she gave them nothing. And nothing, she was learning, was its own form of power. That evening, Adelaide attended a small concert at Mrs. Whitmore's townhouse. She had debated whether to go. It would be the first social event since Monday's tea, but staying home would suggest she was hiding. So she dressed in a modest evening gown of deep green, arranged her hair simply, and arrived precisely on time. The room fell quiet when she entered. Not dramatically, not obviously, but conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes found her, assessed her, looked away. Mrs. Whitmore greeted her with warmth that seemed genuine, though Adelaide could not be certain. "Miss Morland, I'm so pleased you could come. Thank you for the invitation. Please, take any seat you like." Adelaide chose a chair near the back, where she could see but would not be conspicuous. As the other guests filed in, she noticed the careful choreography of avoidance. People took seats near her, but not immediately beside her. They acknowledged her with polite nods but did not engage in conversation. She was present but isolated, included but separate. The concert began. A young pianist performed a series of pieces by Mozart and Beethoven. The music was competent but uninspired. Adelaide found her mind drifting, watching instead the back of Mrs. Dalton's head 3 rows ahead, the way Miss Cartwright leaned toward her sister to whisper something that made them both smile. When it ended, there was polite applause. During the interval, refreshments were served. Adelaide accepted a glass of wine and stood near the window, watching people cluster into groups that reformed and dissolved like water finding its level. No one approached her. Not Lady Ashford, who she saw across the room speaking animatedly with the hostess. Not Miss Cartwright, who looked in her direction once and then deliberately away. Not even Mrs. Dalton, who had always been kind. Adelaide sipped her wine and watched the social machinery operate without her. After 15 minutes, she set down her glass, thanked Mrs. Whitmore for a lovely evening, and left. The carriage ride home was short. When she arrived, the house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the front hall. Her staff had already retired for the evening. Adelaide climbed the stairs slowly, each step requiring more effort than the last. In her bedroom, she undressed herself, too tired to ring for her maid. She hung her gown carefully, removed her jewelry, unpinned her hair. Then she sat at her writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. For several minutes, she simply sat there, pen in hand, looking at the blank page. Finally, she dipped the nib in ink and began to write. "I will not explain myself. I will not justify my existence. I will not beg for understanding. I will not make anyone comfortable with their cruelty. I will simply be." She read the words back to herself. Then she folded the paper, tucked it into the drawer of her desk, and went to bed. That night, Adelaide dreamed of ballrooms, of music and light and laughter, of walking through crowds that parted around her like water, never quite touching, never quite seeing. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and her nightgown damp with sweat. The house was silent. Adelaide rose, crossed to the window, and looked out at the dark street below. Somewhere in this city, the Duchess of Harrington was finalizing her guest list. Lady Crow was overseeing preparations for the ball. People Adelaide had known for years were choosing their gowns and planning their entrances. And Adelaide was here. Alone. Excluded. Unexplained. But not broken. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and made herself a promise. She would attend no more social gatherings before the ball. She would accept no invitations, extend no explanations. She would simply withdraw, not in defeat, but in dignity. If they wanted to exclude her, she would make that exclusion complete. And if they wondered why she did not fight back, did not defend herself, did not demand to know why, well, let them wonder. Silence, Adelaide was learning, could be its own kind of answer. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to play the game they expected you to play. She would not explain. She would not justify. She would simply wait. For what, she did not yet know. But she would wait with her dignity intact and her silence absolute. And somehow, in the strange mathematics of social power, she sensed that her refusal to react was beginning to mean something. What it meant, she could not yet say. But she could feel it. A shift. Small but present. The beginning of something she did not yet have words for. The day of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth. Adelaide woke early, before her maid knocked, and lay in bed watching the morning light pattern itself across the ceiling. She had not slept well. Sleep had become an unreliable companion over the past week, arriving late and departing early, leaving her suspended in the grey space between rest and waking. Today was Tuesday. The ball would begin at 8 o'clock this evening. By 9, the ballroom would be full. By 10, the dancing would be well underway. By midnight, someone would propose a toast to the Duchess, and the room would raise their glasses in unison, 100 voices affirming their collective belonging. Adelaide would not be among them. She rose and dressed slowly, choosing a simple day dress of pale grey muslin. Her maid, Elizabeth, worked in silence, her hands efficient and familiar. They had been together for 3 years now, long enough that Elizabeth knew when conversation was welcome and when it was not. This morning, it was not. After breakfast, tea and toast she barely touched, Adelaide sat in her drawing-room with a book open on her lap. She did not read it. She simply held it, her eyes tracking across the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a single word. The clock on the mantel chimed 11. 7 hours until the ball began. At noon, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. "Miss Morland, I've drawn your bath." Adelaide looked up slowly. "My bath?" "Yes, miss. For this evening." There was no evening. Not for Adelaide. Elizabeth knew this. They had not discussed it. Adelaide had not said aloud that she would not be attending, but the absence of an invitation was not something one could hide from one's own household staff. And yet Elizabeth stood there, her expression neutral, as though preparing Adelaide for a ball she would not attend was the most natural thing in the world. "Elizabeth," Adelaide said carefully, "I won't be." "The bath is ready, miss," Elizabeth interrupted gently. "And I've laid out the blue silk." The blue silk. The gown Adelaide had touched in her wardrobe a week ago, when she still believed she might need it. The gown she had not looked at since closing the wardrobe door after Lady Crow's polite dismissal. "I don't need." "Of course not, miss," Elizabeth agreed, her tone unchanged. "But the bath will grow cold if you don't take it soon." It was not a request. It was not even a suggestion. It was simply a fact, delivered with the kind of calm insistence that made argument seem childish. Adelaide set down her book. She followed Elizabeth upstairs. The bath had been prepared with unusual care. Rose petals floated on the surface of the water, an extravagance Elizabeth had never included before. Steam rose in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of lavender and something else Adelaide couldn't quite identify. Beside the tub, clean towels had been folded with precision, and on the chair nearby, her robe waited. Adelaide undressed in silence. The water was perfect. Not too hot, not too cool. She sank into it slowly, feeling the warmth envelop her, and closed her eyes. She had not realized how tense she had been until her body began to release it. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw unclenched. The knot that had lived in her chest for the past week loosened, just slightly. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to arrive at the ball, to step through the doors into the light and noise and warmth, to be seen, acknowledged, welcomed, to belong to the evening instead of being excluded from it. The fantasy lasted only seconds before reality reasserted itself. She would not be arriving anywhere. She would be here, in this house, in this bath, preparing for an evening that did not include her. When Adelaide finally emerged, Elizabeth was waiting with the towels. She dried Adelaide's hair with methodical patience, then led her to the vanity where she began the slow work of styling it. "How should I arrange it, miss?" Adelaide met Elizabeth's eyes in the mirror. "It doesn't matter. The high style or the low?" "Elizabeth." "The high style, I think," Elizabeth decided, already separating Adelaide's hair into sections. "It suits the neckline of the blue silk." Adelaide said nothing. She watched in the mirror as Elizabeth worked, pinning and twisting and securing each section with the small pearl-tipped pins Adelaide's mother had given her years ago. The style was elegant. formal, appropriate for a ball. When it was finished, Elizabeth stepped back to examine her work. "Perfect," she said quietly. Adelaide's reflection stared back at her. Her hair was beautiful. Her skin glowed from the bath. She looked like a woman preparing for the most important evening of the season. She looked like a lie. "The dress, miss." Adelaide wanted to refuse. Wanted to say no, this was absurd, there was no reason to dress for an event she would not attend. But the words stuck in her throat, and instead she found herself standing, found herself allowing Elizabeth to help her into her undergarments, her corset, her petticoats. The blue silk whispered as Elizabeth lifted it from where it had been laid across the bed. It was more beautiful than Adelaide remembered. The color caught the afternoon light and transformed it into something luminous. The embroidery along the hem was delicate, nearly invisible until the fabric moved. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves short enough to be fashionable without being daring. It was perfect. Elizabeth slipped it over Adelaide's head, and the fabric settled against her skin like water. "There," Elizabeth murmured, fastening the tiny buttons along the back with practiced efficiency. "Just so." Adelaide stood very still as Elizabeth made minor adjustments, smoothing a wrinkle here, adjusting a fold there. When she was finished, she stepped back and gestured toward the full-length mirror in the corner. Adelaide turned to face it. The woman looking back at her was someone she almost didn't recognize. Polished, elegant, prepared, ready to step into a ballroom and command the attention of everyone present. Ready for an evening she would not have. "Your gloves, miss." Elizabeth held out the long white evening gloves that matched the dress perfectly. Adelaide took them, pulled them on slowly, one finger at a time, until her hands disappeared into pristine white silk. And the necklace. Adelaide's hand went to her throat instinctively. The sapphire pendant her father had given her for her 20th birthday. She had worn it only twice, saving it for occasions important enough to warrant something so valuable. This was not such an occasion. And yet she found herself nodding. Elizabeth fastened the clasp at the back of her neck, and the pendant settled into the hollow of Adelaide's throat like it had been made for exactly this moment. When it was done, Elizabeth stepped back once more. She looked at Adelaide for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You look beautiful, miss." Adelaide's throat tightened. "Thank you." "Will you be going out?" The question hung in the air between them. Adelaide looked at herself in the mirror once more. At the gown, the gloves, the hair arranged with such care, the sapphire catching the light. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I will." Elizabeth nodded, as though this answer was exactly what she had expected. "Then shall I bring your dinner up here? You shouldn't eat in that dress, it would be a shame to risk staining it." "Yes. Thank you." Elizabeth left quietly. Adelaide remained standing in front of the mirror. Outside, she could hear the city beginning its transformation into evening. Carriages rattling past on the street below. Voices calling to one another. The distant sound of music drifting from somewhere she couldn't identify. London was preparing for the night. And Adelaide stood alone in her bedroom, dressed for a ball she would not attend, looking at a reflection that belonged to someone else's life. She crossed to the window and looked out. The street was already busy with carriages heading toward Mayfair, toward the grand houses where the season's most important gatherings took place. She watched them pass, one after another, carrying people who had been invited, who belonged, who would spend this evening exactly as she had imagined spending it. The clock in the hallway chimed 7. 1 hour until the ball began. Adelaide turned away from the window. She sat down in the chair by her writing desk, careful not to crush the silk of her gown. She folded her gloved hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. She did not cry. She did not remove the dress. She simply sat, perfectly still, perfectly prepared, in the gathering darkness of her bedroom, while somewhere across the city, a ballroom filled with light and laughter and all the people who had been deemed worthy of attendance. When Elizabeth returned with dinner on a tray, she found Adelaide exactly where she had left her. Seated, composed, beautiful. Alone. Elizabeth set the tray on the table beside her and hesitated. Miss. Yes. Would you like me to stay? Adelaide looked at her maid, this woman who had prepared her with such care for an evening that did not exist, and felt something crack open in her chest. No, she said softly. But thank you. For everything. Elizabeth curtsied and withdrew, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. And Adelaide remained in her chair, dressed in blue silk and sapphires, as the night deepened around her and the ball began without her, miles away and utterly beyond her reach. At 8:30, she stood and crossed to the window once more. The carriages had stopped passing. Everyone who was going to the ball had already gone. The street was empty now. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and watched her breath fog the window, then fade. Tomorrow, she would take off this dress. Tomorrow, she would pack for Bath. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of moving on. But tonight, just for tonight, she allowed herself to stand at the window in her beautiful gown and imagine what it might have felt like to belong somewhere other than here. The clock chimed 9. The dancing would be starting now. Adelaide closed her eyes and let herself imagine just a little longer. Duke Sebastian Langford did not enjoy balls. He attended them because his position required it. Because the Duchess of Harrington was a political ally whose goodwill was strategically valuable. Because absence from such events was itself a form of communication, and he preferred to control what messages he sent. But he did not enjoy them. The noise. The performance. The elaborate pantomime of people pretending their small dramas were matters of consequence. He found it exhausting in a way that genuine work, the kind that shaped legislation or moved economies, never was. Still, here he stood in his study at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, allowing his valet to adjust his cravat for the third time while the guest list for tonight's ball sat on his desk, demanding attention he had not yet given it. The carriage will be ready at 7:30, Your Grace, his secretary, Mr. Winters, reminded him from the doorway. Fine. And the Duchess has requested you arrive no later than 8:15. She wishes to make introductions before the dancing begins. Sebastian glanced at him. Introductions to whom? She did not specify. Of course she hadn't. The Duchess collected people the way some collected art, strategically, with an eye toward value and display. Tonight's introductions would be whoever she had decided was currently worth his attention. Is there anything else? Sebastian asked. The guest list, Your Grace. You asked to review it. Sebastian had asked for it 3 days ago. It had arrived this morning, delivered by Lady Crow herself with a note expressing the Duchess's hope that he would find the assembled company stimulating. He doubted it. But he gestured for Winters to leave it on the desk. After his valet finished his ministrations and departed, Sebastian sat down and pulled the list toward him. 3 pages of names, written in Lady Crow's precise hand, arranged alphabetically within categories of rank and importance. He scanned them with the detached attention he gave most things, noting patterns, filing information, looking for anomalies. Lord and Lady Ashford. Expected. The Pemberton family. Standard. Viscount Morehouse and his insufferable wife. Unfortunate but necessary. His eyes moved down the columns, absorbing and dismissing, until something made him pause. Not a name present. A name absent. He read the list again, more carefully this time. Then a third time. Sebastian set down the paper and leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming once against the armrest, a habit he had broken years ago but which occasionally resurged when something bothered him. Miss Adelaide Morland was not on the list. This should not have surprised him. He had met her perhaps 4 times in the past 2 years, always briefly, always in contexts where extended conversation was neither expected nor possible. She was not a woman who commanded attention. Her connections were respectable but not illustrious. Her fortune was modest. She had no family scandal to make her interesting, no particular beauty to make her conspicuous. By any reasonable standard, her exclusion made sense. And yet, Sebastian picked up the list again and studied the names that were included. Miss Cartwright. Pretty but vapid, notable primarily for her talent at saying whatever her listener wanted to hear. Mrs. Dalton's daughter, who had been presented just this season and whose primary accomplishment was not tripping over her own gown. Lady Pemberton's niece, recently arrived from the country with all the sophistication of a startled rabbit. 3 women who were younger, less educated, and less interesting than Adelaide Morland in every measurable way. But they were included. Sebastian set down the list and stood, crossing to the window. Outside, London was preparing for evening. Carriages clogged the streets. Servants rushed to complete last-minute errands. Somewhere across the city, dressmakers were making final adjustments to gowns, jewelers were retrieving pieces from vaults, and hairdressers were being summoned to create increasingly elaborate arrangements. And Adelaide Morland, who should have been among them, was not. Why? The question lodged itself in his mind with the particular irritation of a small stone in a boot. Ignorable at first, then increasingly difficult to dismiss. Sebastian had built his reputation on attention to detail, on noticing the things others missed, on understanding that sometimes the most important information was what wasn't said, what wasn't present, what had been deliberately removed. He returned to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. In his own hand, he did not summon Winters for this, he wrote a single question. Was Miss Adelaide Morland's exclusion deliberate or an oversight? Then he folded it, sealed it, and rang for a footman. Deliver this to Lady Henrietta Crowe. Wait for a reply. The footman departed. Sebastian returned to the window. 20 minutes later, the footman returned with Lady Crowe's response. Sebastian broke the seal and read, Your Grace. Miss Morland's absence from the guest list was not an oversight. The decision was made after careful consideration of spatial constraints and the overall composition of attendees. I trust you will find the final selection entirely appropriate to the occasion. With respect. Lady Henrietta Crowe. Sebastian read it twice. The wording was careful, professional, and entirely evasive. Careful consideration of spatial constraints. The Harrington Ballroom could accommodate 200 people comfortably. According to the guest list, they were expecting 173. Overall composition of attendees. A phrase that meant everything and nothing. Composition according to what criteria? Beauty, wealth, political value, the ability to dance without causing injury. Sebastian set down the letter and realized something. Lady Crowe had not actually explained the exclusion. She had simply asserted it was intentional and expressed confidence that he would find it acceptable, which meant she either could not explain it, or would not. Both possibilities were troubling. Sebastian checked his pocket watch. 6:30. He had an hour before the carriage would depart. He sat at his desk and pulled out another sheet of paper. This time, he wrote a longer note. Lady Crowe, I appreciate your prompt response. However, I find myself curious about the specific considerations that led to Miss Morland's exclusion. She has been a regular attendee at similar gatherings throughout the season. Her absence, absent clear explanation, strikes me as unusual. Might you elaborate on the reasoning? Langford. He sent it. This time, the reply took longer. Nearly 40 minutes. Sebastian dressed while he waited, his mind turning over possibilities. When the response finally arrived, he opened it immediately. Your Grace. Miss Morland is of course a respectable woman, and no one would suggest otherwise. However, the Duchess felt that for this particular occasion, given its significance and the caliber of attendees, a more curated selection was appropriate. Miss Morland, while perfectly pleasant, does not quite rise to the level of distinction the Duchess wished to achieve. I hope this satisfies your inquiry. Lady Henrietta Crowe. Sebastian read the letter standing in the middle of his dressing room, still holding his evening gloves. Does not quite rise to the level of distinction. The phrase was a masterpiece of polite cruelty. It said everything and nothing. It conveyed exclusion without stating a specific reason. It suggested inadequacy without identifying an actual flaw. It was, Sebastian recognized, The kind of language people used when they had made a decision based on personal preference and were attempting to justify it retroactively with objective-sounding criteria. He had used such language himself, in political contexts, when he needed to exclude someone without providing ammunition for their defenders. He knew it when he saw it. And he was seeing it now. Sebastian set down the letter and finished dressing. At 7:30, he descended to his carriage. The evening was unseasonably warm, and through the window he watched London transform itself into its nocturnal version, louder, brighter, more dangerous and more beautiful than its daylight self. The carriage rolled through familiar streets toward the Harrington residence. Sebastian had attended dozens of balls at this house. Hundreds of social gatherings across his lifetime. He had learned to navigate them with the same strategic precision he brought to Parliament, identify objectives, minimize wasted effort, extract maximum value from minimum engagement. Tonight would be no different. Except that somewhere in London, Adelaide Morland was not preparing for this ball, was not dressing in her finest gown, was not anticipating the evening with whatever mixture of hope and anxiety people brought to such events. She had been told she was not distinguished enough. Not by rejection, rejection was honest, at least, but by omission. By a name simply not appearing on a list. By Lady Crow's careful, evasive language about composition and caliber. The carriage pulled up to the Harrington residence at precisely 8:10. Sebastian stepped out into the warm evening air and looked up at the house. Every window blazed with light. Music drifted from the ballroom. Carriages lined the street, depositing guests who laughed and called to one another as they climbed the steps. Inside, 173 people would dance and drink and perform their elaborate social rituals. Adelaide Morland would not be among them. Sebastian climbed the steps. At the entrance, a footman took his hat and gloves. Another directed him toward the ballroom, where the Duchess was already receiving guests. But Sebastian did not proceed to the ballroom. Instead, he turned left, toward the small study where he knew Lady Crow would be stationed, overseeing last-minute details with the efficiency that had made her indispensable to the Duchess. He found her exactly where he expected, seated at a desk with the guest list spread before her, making notations in the margins. She looked up when he entered, and her expression shifted through surprise to carefully arranged pleasantness. "Your Grace, the Duchess is expecting you in the ballroom." "I have a question about the list," Sebastian said. Lady Crow's smile held. "Of course. How may I help?" Sebastian closed the door behind him. The sound of it shutting seemed louder than it should have been. "Miss Adelaide Morland," he said. "Why is her name not on this list?" Lady Crow's expression did not change, but something in her posture stiffened slightly. "I explained this in my correspondence, Your Grace. The decision was made based on—" "Spatial constraints," Sebastian interrupted. "Yes, I read your letter. And the second one, about distinction and caliber. Then I'm not certain what further explanation. I want the real reason." The room went quiet. Lady Crow set down her pen with deliberate care. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional warmth. "Your Grace, with respect, the guest list is the Duchess's prerogative. She has entrusted me with its execution, and I have done so according to her wishes and my best judgment. Miss Morland is a perfectly respectable woman, but she is not essential. There are only so many places, and difficult choices must be made. She has attended every major gathering this season." "Yes." "Including the Duchess's own garden party in June." "Yes." "So what changed?" Lady Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with perfect politeness, "Nothing changed, Your Grace. We simply decided to be more selective." It was the wrong answer. Not because it was false, though Sebastian suspected it was, but because it revealed exactly what he had suspected. This was not about space. It was not about distinction. It was not about any objective measure of worthiness. It was about power. The power to include and exclude. The power to decide who was essential and who was merely respectable. The power to reshape social reality with nothing more than a pen and a guest list. Lady Crow had that power, and she had used it. Sebastian looked at the woman sitting before him, at the guest list spread on her desk, at the careful notations in the margins, each one a small exercise in control. Then he reached down and picked up the list. "Your Grace." He did not respond. He simply scanned the names until he found what he was looking for. There. Third page. Near the bottom. Miss Elizabeth Cartwright. He had met her once. She had spent 15 minutes explaining why she preferred yellow roses to pink ones, a conversation that had felt significantly longer than its actual duration. Sebastian pulled a pen from Lady Crow's desk. "Your Grace, I must protest." He drew a single, decisive line through Miss Cartwright's name. The ink was black. The line was absolute. Then, in the margin beside it, in his own hand, he wrote, "Miss Adelaide Morland." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Crow stared at the list, at the crossed-out name, at the addition that had just rewritten her carefully curated composition. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of politeness. "You cannot do this." Sebastian set down the pen and met her eyes. "I just did. The Duchess will accept my judgment. As Lady Crow, will you?" It was not a question. Sebastian picked up the altered list and held it out to her. Lady Crow took it with hands that trembled slightly. "Send word to Miss Morland," Sebastian said. "Tonight. Her presence is requested at the ball." "Tonight. Your Grace, the ball has already begun." "Then she will arrive late. Send a carriage if necessary." "But Miss Cartwright will survive the disappointment." Sebastian moved toward the door. "Your Grace." He paused, hand on the doorknob. Lady Crow stood behind her desk, the altered guest list still clutched in her hands. Her expression was complex, shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. "May I ask why?" she said quietly. "Why her? Why this?" Sebastian considered the question. He could have said it was about fairness, about correcting an injustice, about refusing to let petty power go unchecked. All of those things were true. But the simpler truth was this: he had noticed an absence where others had seen nothing at all. And he had the authority to correct it. "Because the list was wrong," he said. Then he opened the door and left Lady Crow standing in her study, holding the evidence of power exercised quietly, decisively, and without appeal. In the ballroom, the dancing had begun. Sebastian entered to find the Duchess holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by guests competing for her attention. She saw him immediately and beckoned him over. But Sebastian was no longer thinking about the ball, or the dancing, or the elaborate performance of social hierarchy happening around him. He was thinking about a woman in a house somewhere across London. A woman who, in approximately 1 hour, would receive a message that would change her evening. And possibly, though Sebastian did not yet know this, would change something larger than either of them yet understood. He had struck a name from a list. Everything else would follow from that single act. Whether for good or ill, he would discover soon enough. The knock came at 9:30. Adelaide had been sitting in the dark for nearly an hour, still dressed in the blue silk, watching shadows lengthen across her bedroom walls. She had not lit any additional candles. The single lamp Elizabeth had left burning was enough to see by, and Adelaide found she preferred the dimness. It felt appropriate somehow, a half-light for a half-lived evening. The knock was firm, insistent, not the tentative tap of a maid checking if she needed anything. Adelaide heard voices downstairs. Her butler's measured tones, formal even at this hour. Then another voice, male, unfamiliar. Footsteps on the stairs. A pause outside her door. Then her butler's voice, "Miss Morland? Forgive the intrusion, but there is a situation that requires your immediate attention." Adelaide rose slowly, careful not to crush the silk. "Come in, Morrison." The door opened. Her butler stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested something deeply irregular was occurring. "Miss Morland, there is a messenger downstairs. From the Duchess of Harrington's residence. He says he has been instructed to wait for your reply." The words took a moment to arrange themselves into meaning. A messenger. From the Duchess. At 9:30 on the evening of the ball. "I see," Adelaide said, though she did not see at all. "What is the message?" Morrison held out a cream-colored envelope. The Duchess's seal, pressed into burgundy wax. The same seal Adelaide had watched for, waited for, expected for a week. The seal that had never arrived. Her hands were steady as she took it. This surprised her. She had expected them to shake. "Shall I have the messenger wait in the entrance hall?" Morrison asked. "Yes. Thank you." Morrison withdrew, closing the door with a soft click. Adelaide stood in the lamplight, holding the envelope she had stopped believing would come. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. The weight of it. The texture of the paper. The burgundy wax that caught the light. Then she broke the seal. Inside was a single card, written in a hand she recognized as Lady Crow's. "Miss Adelaide Morland. Your presence is requested at the Duchess of Harrington's ball this evening. A carriage has been sent for your convenience and will wait at your disposal. The Duchess extends her sincere apologies for the delayed invitation and hopes you will honor her with your attendance. Lady Henrietta Crow." Adelaide read it 3 times. Each time, the words remained the same, but their meaning seemed to shift, becoming less rather than more clear. "Your presence is requested." Present tense. Not was requested. Not had been requested. Is requested. A carriage has been sent. Not will be sent. Has been sent. Already dispatched. Already waiting. Delayed invitation. Not error. Not oversight. Delayed. As though it had always been coming, had simply taken longer to arrive than expected. Adelaide crossed to the window and looked down at the street. There, directly in front of her house, stood a carriage. Not hired, she could tell by the quality of it, but one of the Duchess's own. The crest was visible even in the lamplight. 2 liveried footmen stood beside it, waiting. For her. Adelaide's mind moved through possibilities with mechanical precision. This was a mistake. Someone had written the wrong name. This was a cruel joke. An elaborate humiliation. This was a test. To see if she would come running after being so publicly excluded. This was. She stopped. Looked at the card again. The Duchess extends her sincere apologies. The Duchess. Not Lady Crow. The Duchess. Whatever this was, it had come from the highest authority. Lady Crow had written the card, but she had done so on the Duchess's instruction. Which meant this was not a mistake. It was a reversal. Adelaide's breath came faster now. A reversal. At 9:30. After the ball had already begun. After Adelaide had spent the entire evening dressed and alone, after she had been excluded publicly, humiliated politely, dismissed with careful language about space and distinction. After all of that. Now, the invitation. Rage moved through her, sudden and hot. No. She had accepted the exclusion with dignity. She had not protested, had not demanded explanations, had not made anyone uncomfortable with her disappointment. She had done everything correctly, had played by every rule, had maintained her composure even when it cost her everything. And now they wanted her to come? Now, after she had been sitting here in the dark, dressed in blue silk with nowhere to go, watching the hours pass while everyone else danced. Now they remembered her. Adelaide's hands tightened on the card, crumpling it slightly. She would refuse. She would send the messenger back with her polite regrets. She would say she had already retired for the evening, or had made other plans, or simply was not available. She would refuse, because to accept would be to suggest that she could be summoned and dismissed at will, that her time and dignity were negotiable, that she would come when called like. Adelaide stopped. Looked at the card again. At the careful handwriting. The formal language. the carriage waiting below. She thought about Lady Crow's face when she had delivered the original exclusion. The practiced sympathy. The subtle suggestion that Adelaide was reasonable enough to accept this gracefully. She thought about Lady Ashford's visit, the way her old friend had come seeking confirmation that Adelaide had done something to deserve exclusion. She thought about the whispers, the withdrawn invitations, the careful distance everyone had maintained. She thought about sitting at Mrs. Whitmore's concert, present but isolated, included but separate. And she realized something. Refusing this invitation would be satisfying. It would feel powerful. It would be a clear statement that she could not be manipulated. But it would also be invisible. If she stayed home, no one at the ball would know she had been invited. They would only know she had not attended. And her absence, which had already been explained away, justified, absorbed into the social narrative, would simply continue. But if she went, if she appeared at the ball after being so publicly excluded, if she walked into that ballroom wearing this blue silk gown, with her hair arranged and her sapphire pendant catching the light, that would be visible. That would require explanation. That would force everyone who had watched her be dismissed to reconcile two conflicting pieces of information. She had been excluded, and now she was here. Adelaide looked down at her gown. She was already dressed. She had already endured the preparation, the ritual, the slow torture of making herself beautiful for an evening she would not attend. And now she had a choice. She could stay home and let that preparation mean nothing. Or she could use it. Adelaide crossed to her door and opened it. "Morrison," she called down the stairs. He appeared immediately, as though he had been waiting. "Tell the messenger I will attend. I require 5 minutes to collect my things." If Morrison was surprised, he did not show it. "Very good, Miss Morland." Adelaide closed the door. 5 minutes. She moved with sudden, decisive efficiency. Gloves, she had already put them on earlier and removed them. She pulled them on again, the silk sliding over her fingers with practiced ease. Her reticule, small, beaded, containing only a handkerchief and her calling cards. She checked its contents mechanically. Her cloak, the black velvet one that complemented the blue silk without overwhelming it. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time. The woman looking back was the same one who had stood here an hour ago. But something in her expression had changed. She no longer looked like someone dressed for an evening that didn't exist. She looked like someone going to war. Adelaide descended the stairs. Morrison waited in the entrance hall with her cloak already in hand. He draped it over her shoulders with the care of someone handling something fragile. "Shall I wait up for your return, miss?" he asked quietly. "No. I don't know how late I'll be." "Very good, miss." He opened the door. The night air was warm against her face. The carriage waited, both footmen at attention. One moved immediately to open the door and lower the step. Adelaide paused on the threshold of her house. Behind her was safety, the known. The controlled space where she had spent this entire evening alone but undisturbed. Ahead was uncertainty. The ballroom where she had been excluded. The people who had watched it happen. The Duchess who had allowed it. Lady Crow who had executed it. For a moment, Adelaide let herself consider turning back. Then she thought, no. I was already humiliated. I was already dismissed. I have already endured the worst of this. What's one more walk into a room full of people who didn't want me there? Adelaide lifted her chin and descended the steps. The footman handed her into the carriage. The door closed. The vehicle rocked slightly as the driver took his seat. Then they were moving. Adelaide sat in the dim interior and watched London pass by the window. They moved through streets she knew, past houses she recognized. The city looked different at night, sharper, more dangerous, more beautiful. She had walked through this city for years in daylight, always appropriate, always proper, always careful not to attract the wrong kind of attention. Tonight, she was being driven through it in the Duchess's own carriage, toward a ball she had been told she was not distinguished enough to attend. The journey took 12 minutes. Adelaide counted them. When the carriage slowed, she felt her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain calm. The Harrington residence blazed with light. Every window glowed. Music drifted from inside, layered with laughter and conversation. Other carriages lined the street, though most guests had clearly already arrived. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. Adelaide took his offered hand and stepped down onto the street. She could turn around. She could get back in the carriage right now and ask to be taken home. No one had seen her yet. She could still retreat with her dignity intact. But she didn't. She climbed the steps. At the entrance, a footman she didn't recognize took her cloak. His expression was perfectly neutral, as though late-arriving guests were entirely normal. "The ballroom is straight ahead, miss," he said. Adelaide nodded. She could hear the music more clearly now. A waltz, elegant and sweeping. She could hear voices, dozens of them, creating a constant murmur beneath the melody. She moved down the hallway toward the sound. The ballroom doors were open. Adelaide stood in the doorway and looked inside. The room was exactly as magnificent as she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors. Women in jewel-colored gowns spun across the dance floor in the arms of men in formal black. The walls were lined with guests talking, laughing, drinking champagne from crystal glasses. Everyone was there. Lady Ashford, dancing with her husband. Mrs. Dalton, standing near the refreshment table with her daughter. Miss Cartwright. Adelaide's eyes found her across the room. Miss Cartwright stood near the windows, her expression oddly pinched, speaking with her sister in low, urgent tones. She looked upset. Adelaide filed this observation away. Then she took a breath, lifted her chin, and stepped into the ballroom. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone near the door noticed her. The woman, Lady Pemberton, stopped mid-sentence, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. The person she'd been speaking with turned to look. Then another. The silence spread like water, starting at the door and rippling outward, conversation after conversation faltering and stopping as heads turned toward the entrance. Toward Adelaide. Standing in the doorway in her blue silk gown, her sapphire pendant catching the chandelier light, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Present. Visible. Undeniably, irrevocably here. The music continued, but fewer people were dancing now. The room had reorganized its attention. Adelaide did not look away. Did not drop her eyes. Did not apologize for existing in a space she had been told she did not belong. She simply stood there, and waited to see what would happen next. Sebastian had been watching the door. Not obviously. Not with the kind of attention that would draw notice. But he had positioned himself near the refreshment table with a clear sightline to the ballroom entrance, and every few minutes his gaze drifted that direction. He had sent the carriage nearly 2 hours ago. The message should have reached Miss Morland by 9:30. The journey from her residence would take 15 minutes, perhaps 20 if traffic was difficult. She would need time to prepare, though if his observation of her at previous gatherings was accurate, she would not require much. Adelaide Morland did not seem like a woman who fussed. So she should have arrived by 10:15 at the latest. It was now 10:40. Sebastian took another sip of champagne he didn't want and considered the possibilities. She had refused the invitation. Possible, though the carriage had been instructed to wait for a response, and none had been sent back. She had left London already. Also possible. He knew she had been planning to visit Bath. Perhaps she had departed before the message arrived. Or she was coming, and simply taking her time about it. That last possibility interested him most. "Your Grace, you seem distracted." Sebastian turned to find the Duchess of Harrington standing beside him, her expression pleasant but her eyes sharp. "My apologies, Your Grace. Merely observing." Observing anything in particular? The usual dynamics. Who speaks with whom? Who avoids whom? The small choreographies that make these gatherings function. The Duchess smiled. "How analytical of you. Though I suspect you're observing something more specific than general social patterns." Sebastian met her eyes. The Duchess was not a fool. She would have been informed by now about the alteration to her guest list. Lady Crow would have told her, though Sebastian couldn't predict what spin had been put on it. "I understand there was a late addition to your guest list," the Duchess said, confirming his suspicion. "Yes." "Miss Adelaide Morland." "Yes." "May I ask what prompted this revision?" Sebastian considered his response. The Duchess was an ally, but she was also someone who valued control over her own domain. Having her guest list altered by someone else, even someone of his rank, would not sit comfortably. "I noticed an omission that seemed inconsistent with the caliber of other attendees," Sebastian said. "I took the liberty of correcting it." "An omission?" The Duchess's tone was neutral, but there was steel underneath. "Lady Crow assures me the original list was quite deliberately composed." "I'm certain it was." "And yet you felt it required correction." "I did." They looked at each other. Around them, the ball continued, dancing, conversation, the steady hum of society performing itself. "Your Grace," the Duchess said carefully, "I hope you understand that such interventions, while certainly within your authority, create complications. They raise questions about whose judgment guides these occasions." "The correct judgment should guide them," Sebastian replied, "regardless of whose it is." The Duchess's expression flickered, irritation, perhaps, or grudging respect. "You've put me in an awkward position," she said. "I apologize for that. It was not my intention. And yet here we are. If Miss Morland arrives—" "When she arrives." "If she arrives," the Duchess continued, "I will be expected to welcome her warmly, to treat her late addition as though it were always intended, to pretend no irregularity occurred." "Yes. That's quite presumptuous of you, Your Grace." "It is," Sebastian agreed. "But it's also correct." The Duchess studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a genuine sound that drew several nearby glances. "You know what I appreciate about you, Langford? You don't pretend to be apologetic when you're not. Most men would offer elaborate justifications. You simply state what you've done and expect others to adjust. Is that appreciation or criticism?" "Both." The Duchess's expression softened slightly. "Lady Crow is quite upset, you realize." "I imagine she is. She feels her authority has been undermined." "Her authority was exercised poorly. I simply provided correction." "And Miss Morland? What is she to you?" The question was direct in a way that required an equally direct answer. "Nothing beyond an error in need of correction," Sebastian said. "I noticed an inconsistency. I addressed it. There is no personal connection." "People will assume there is." "People assume many things. I cannot control speculation." "But you can control your own actions. And your actions tonight will be interpreted as particular interest in Miss Morland. Then they will be misinterpreted." The Duchess sighed. "Well, what's done is done. If she arrives, I shall welcome her graciously and pretend this was all perfectly normal. But Langford—" "Yes. Don't make a habit of rewriting my guest lists. Once is a demonstration of principle. Twice would be an insult to my judgment." "Understood." The Duchess moved away to greet other guests, leaving Sebastian alone again with his untouched champagne and his view of the door. 10:50. The music swelled. Another waltz began. Couples moved onto the floor with practiced elegance. And then, at the edge of his vision, Sebastian saw movement at the entrance. He turned fully, abandoning any pretense of casual observation. Adelaide Morland stood in the doorway. She wore blue silk that caught the chandelier light and transformed it into something luminous. Her hair was arranged with elegant simplicity. A sapphire pendant rested at her throat. She looked, Sebastian thought, exactly as she should have looked all along. And she looked terrified. No, not terrified. That wasn't quite right. Her expression was composed, her posture perfect. But there was something in her eyes, in the set of her shoulders, that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She had come. Despite everything. Despite the public exclusion, despite the humiliation, despite having every reasonable excuse to refuse this invitation, she had come. Sebastian watched as the room noticed her. Saw conversations falter. Saw heads turn. Saw the ripple of recognition spread outward from the entrance. Saw the Duchess detach herself from her group and cross toward Adelaide with practiced grace. The intervention was complete. He had struck a name from a list and written another in its place. Now he would see what happened when the correction became visible. Sebastian remained where he was, watching. The Duchess reached Adelaide. Spoke to her. Adelaide responded. The exchange was brief, professional, perfectly calibrated. And then the Duchess turned toward him, a deliberate movement that caught his attention and held it. She was bringing Adelaide to him. Sebastian set down his champagne. They approached together, the Duchess guiding Adelaide through the crowd with the same confidence she used to navigate every social situation. "Your Grace," the Duchess said when they reached him. "I believe you've met Miss Morland." "I have." "Miss Morland." Sebastian inclined his head. Adelaide curtsied. Her face was carefully neutral, but he could see the rapid pulse at her throat, could sense the tension she was holding beneath the composed exterior. "Miss Morland has only just arrived," the Duchess continued. "I was about to make introductions, but I thought perhaps you might request the honor of the next dance." It was not a suggestion. It was a strategic maneuver. The Duchess was making clear that whatever had prompted Sebastian's intervention, she was choosing to support it publicly. By having him dance with Adelaide immediately, she was sending a message to everyone watching. This late arrival was not only acceptable, it was noteworthy. "I would be honored," Sebastian said, offering his hand to Adelaide. Adelaide looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than courtesy required. He saw something flash in her eyes, surprise, calculation, possibly anger. But she placed her hand in his. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly. They moved onto the dance floor as the previous waltz ended and the musicians began preparing the next. "You came," Sebastian said as they took their positions. "The invitation was quite insistent," Adelaide replied, her voice steady despite the pulse he could feel through her gloved hand. "Was it?" "A carriage was sent." "I'm aware." The music began. Sebastian's hand settled at her waist. They began to move. For several measures, neither spoke. Adelaide danced competently, her steps precise, but there was a rigidity to her posture that suggested she was using every ounce of concentration to maintain control. "You didn't have to accept," Sebastian said finally. Adelaide's eyes met his sharply. "Didn't I?" "No. You could have sent the carriage away. Could have remained at home. Could have refused without explanation. And what would that have accomplished? It would have preserved your dignity on your own terms rather than on terms dictated by someone else's intervention." Adelaide missed a step, barely, almost imperceptibly, before recovering. "You're suggesting I should have refused," she said slowly. "I'm observing that you had a choice. And I'm curious why you made the one you did." They turned. The ballroom spun around them in a blur of light and color and watching faces. "Because," Adelaide said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "refusing would have been invisible. And I was tired of being invisible." Sebastian looked at her properly then. At the sapphire at her throat. At the careful arrangement of her hair. At the blue silk that she had clearly been wearing for some time before the invitation arrived. "You were already dressed," he said. Something flickered across Adelaide's face, embarrassment, perhaps, or defiance. "Yes." "For a ball you weren't attending?" "Yes." "Why?" Adelaide's jaw tightened. "Because I refused to let them make me disappear. Even if the only person who saw me was myself." The answer hit Sebastian with unexpected force. She had not dressed for the ball in hope of attending. She had dressed because refusing to do so would have been accepting erasure. She had claimed the ritual of preparation even when the destination didn't exist. It was, he realized, the most dignified form of defiance possible. "I see," Sebastian said quietly. "Do you?" "Yes. And I think I understand you better than I did 5 minutes ago." "Should I be pleased or concerned about that?" "Neither. It simply is." They continued to dance. Around them, Sebastian could sense the room adjusting. Could feel the attention focused on them, the speculation beginning to form and solidify. "They're watching us," Adelaide said. "Yes. They're going to assume things. About why you intervened. About what connection exists between us. They will. And you don't care." Sebastian guided her through a turn. "I care about accuracy more than speculation. The accuracy is that your exclusion was an error. The speculation about why I corrected it is irrelevant. Irrelevant to you, perhaps. But I'm the one who will have to live with whatever narrative they construct." She wasn't wrong. Whatever story society settled on, whether it cast her as his particular interest, or his project, or his charity case, she would be the one most affected by it. "I apologize," Sebastian said. "I didn't fully consider that consequence." Adelaide looked surprised. "You're apologizing?" "For the complication I've created for you, yes. Though not for the correction itself." "The correction," Adelaide repeated. "You keep using that word." "Because it's accurate. It makes me sound like an error in arithmetic." "You weren't the error. Your exclusion was." The music swelled toward its conclusion. Their final turn brought them back to their starting position. "What happens now?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Now you stay at this ball for as long as you choose. You speak with whomever you wish. You allow yourself to be seen. And tomorrow, society will have adjusted to accommodate the fact that you belong in spaces like this." Just like that. Just like that. The music ended. Sebastian released her and stepped back. Around them, other couples were doing the same, the dance floor clearing as people returned to conversations and refreshments. "Miss Morland," Sebastian said formally, "thank you for the dance." Adelaide curtsied. "Your Grace." He turned to walk away, then paused and looked back. "One more thing." "Yes." "You were never invisible. You were simply unseen. Those are different things." Before Adelaide could respond, Sebastian walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He had done what needed to be done. The error had been corrected. The intervention was complete. Now he would see if the correction held. Sebastian found a position near the wall where he could observe without being conspicuous. From there, he watched as Adelaide stood alone for a moment at the edge of the dance floor. Watched as the Duchess approached her again, this time with several other guests in tow. Watched as Lady Ashford materialized at Adelaide's side with manufactured enthusiasm. Watched as Mrs. Dalton joined the growing cluster around her. The room was adjusting. In real time, before his eyes, society was rewriting its understanding of Adelaide Morland. Not because she had changed, but because he had indicated that the previous understanding was incorrect. It was, Sebastian thought, both the most useful and most dangerous aspect of power. The ability to reshape reality simply by stating that the current version was wrong. He had used that power tonight. Whether he had used it well remained to be seen. Across the room, Adelaide caught his eye. Their gazes held for a moment. She inclined her head fractionally, acknowledgement, not gratitude. Sebastian returned the gesture. Then he turned and left the ballroom. His work here was finished. Adelaide Morland was no longer invisible. What she did with that visibility was now entirely her concern. Sebastian collected his hat and gloves from the entrance hall and stepped out into the warm night air. Behind him, the ball continued without him. Ahead, his carriage waited. And somewhere between those 2 points, Sebastian allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had noticed an error that everyone else had overlooked. He had corrected it with minimal disruption and maximum efficiency. And he had demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, that power exercised correctly didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It simply needed to be precise. Real power didn't argue. It edited. And tonight, Sebastian Langford had held the pen. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Adelaide counted them. Then the Duchess of Harrington moved. She detached herself from the cluster of guests surrounding her with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, crossing the ballroom floor with purpose but without haste. Her expression was carefully arranged, warmth overlaying something harder, more calculated. "Miss Morland," the Duchess said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearest. "How delighted I am that you could join us after all." The emphasis on "after all" was subtle but unmistakable. Adelaide curtsied. "Your Grace. Thank you for the invitation. The evening would have been diminished without you." It was a lie, but it was a lie spoken with such conviction that it became indistinguishable from truth. The Duchess was creating a new reality in real time, one in which Adelaide had always been intended as a guest and her late arrival was simply an unfortunate delay rather than a reversal of exclusion. Adelaide understood what was being offered. A narrative. A story they could all agree to believe. One that would smooth over the awkwardness, eliminate the questions, allow everyone to pretend nothing unusual had occurred. All Adelaide had to do was accept it. "I apologize for my tardiness," Adelaide heard herself say. "I'm afraid the invitation was delayed in reaching me." The Duchess's eyes sharpened momentarily, a flicker of something that might have been respect, before her expression returned to practiced warmth. "These things happen," the Duchess said. "What matters is that you're here now. Come, let me introduce you to—" But before she could finish, someone else approached. Duke Sebastian Langford. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who did not need to ask permission to interrupt. People shifted automatically to make space for him, conversations pausing as he passed. He stopped beside the Duchess and inclined his head fractionally. "Your Grace." "Your Grace," the Duchess replied, and there was something complex in her tone. "I was just welcoming Miss Morland." "I see that." Sebastian's gaze moved to Adelaide. "Miss Morland. I trust the evening finds you well." It was a standard greeting. Polite. Impersonal. The kind of thing one said to someone one had met a handful of times at formal gatherings. But there was something in his eyes, a brief, assessing look, that suggested he was measuring her response to all of this with the same precision he might apply to a political negotiation. "Very well, thank you, Your Grace," Adelaide replied. A pause. The three of them stood in a small tableau while the ballroom watched, pretending not to watch. Then Sebastian said, "I wonder if I might request the honor of the next dance, Miss Morland." The room, which had been gradually resuming its previous activity, went quiet again. Adelaide felt the weight of the request. This was not simply a dance. This was a public declaration. The Duke, one of the most powerful men in the room, was singling her out for attention. Whatever had happened to bring her here, his request for a dance would cement her belonging in a way nothing else could. But it would also bind her to him. Would create an association, a narrative in which she had been elevated not by her own merit but by his recognition. Adelaide met his eyes. They were grey, analytical, watching her with the kind of attention that suggested he was aware of exactly what he was offering and what it would cost. She could refuse. It would be bold, possibly disastrous, but it would establish that she was here on her own terms, not as anyone's project or charity case. But then she thought, "I'm already here. Already visible. Already the subject of speculation. What's one more strategic compromise?" "I would be honored, Your Grace," Adelaide said. Sebastian offered his hand. Adelaide took it. They moved onto the dance floor as the musicians began a new waltz. Sebastian's hand settled at her waist with practiced formality. His grip on her other hand was light but secure. They began to dance. For the first minute, neither spoke. Adelaide focused on the steps, on maintaining proper form, on not betraying how strange this all felt. She had danced before, at smaller gatherings, with less consequential partners, but never like this. Never with someone whose choice to dance with her was itself a form of communication to everyone watching. "You came," Sebastian said finally. It was not a question, but Adelaide heard the curiosity beneath it. "The invitation was quite insistent," she replied carefully. "Was it?" "A carriage was sent." "I'm aware." Something in his tone made Adelaide look up sharply. His expression was neutral, but there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested. "You sent the carriage," Adelaide said slowly. Sebastian did not confirm or deny this. He simply guided her through a turn with effortless precision. "The guest list was incorrect," he said after a moment. "I corrected it." Adelaide's mind raced. "I corrected it. Not the Duchess corrected it. Not we realized the error." Why?" The question escaped before Adelaide could stop it. Sebastian looked down at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in those grey eyes, something that might have been surprised that she had asked so directly. "Because your absence made no sense," he said simply. "I reviewed the list, compared it to previous gatherings, noted the attendees who were included. Your exclusion was anomalous." "Anomalous," Adelaide repeated. "Illogical." He spoke as though he were explaining a mathematical error, as though her worth could be calculated objectively and the calculations had come out in her favor. Adelaide did not know whether to be grateful or offended. "I see," she said. "Do you?" She met his eyes again. "You corrected an error in a dataset." Something that might have been amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "That is one way to describe it." "How would you describe it?" Sebastian guided her through another turn. Around them, other couples danced, but Adelaide was only dimly aware of them. Her entire focus had narrowed to this conversation, to understanding what exactly had occurred and why. "I would describe it," Sebastian said carefully, "as a decision made by someone with insufficient information being overridden by someone with better judgment." Lady Crow. Lady Crow has many talents. Perspective is not consistently among them. It was the most damning thing Adelaide had heard him say, delivered in a tone so neutral it took a moment for the criticism to register. "She'll hate me for this," Adelaide said quietly. "She'll adjust." "Will she?" Sebastian's hand tightened fractionally at her waist, a gesture so slight Adelaide almost missed it. "She will," he said, "because I have made it clear that any future guest list excluding you will be revised. Repeatedly, if necessary, until she understands that certain decisions are no longer hers to make." Adelaide stumbled slightly. Sebastian steadied her immediately, his grip firm but not constraining. "I apologize," Adelaide said. "I'm not usually so clumsy." "You're doing remarkably well considering the circumstances." "The circumstances being that I was publicly excluded, summoned at the last minute, and am now dancing with someone who apparently rewrote the social order on my behalf." "Yes, those circumstances." There was definitely amusement in his expression now, subtle but present. The music swelled. They moved through the final measures of the waltz. As they did, Adelaide became aware of the room again, of the eyes still watching them, of the whispered conversations happening at the edges of her vision. Everyone was recalibrating. She could see it happening in real time. Lady Ashford stood near the refreshment table, watching with an expression that mixed confusion and calculation. Mrs. Dalton had moved closer to get a better view, her earlier distance forgotten. Even Miss Cartwright, whose name had been replaced with Adelaide's, though Adelaide still didn't know this for certain, was watching with barely concealed hostility. But watching was not the same as excluding. Being seen, even with confusion, even with hostility, was different from being invisible. The music ended. Sebastian released her and stepped back, offering a formal bow. Adelaide curtsied in return. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Morland," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "One more thing." Yes. Don't thank me. Adelaide blinked. I don't understand. You shouldn't have needed an intervention. Your inclusion should have been automatic. Thanking me for correcting someone else's error implies gratitude for something that should never have required correction in the first place. He said this with the same analytical tone he had used throughout their conversation, as though he were explaining a logical principle rather than fundamentally redefining her understanding of what had just occurred. Then he walked away, disappearing back into the crowd with the same unhurried confidence he had arrived with. Adelaide stood on the edge of the dance floor, alone again but somehow less alone than she had been before. The room had not stopped watching. But it was watching differently now. Before, they had watched her exclusion with varying degrees of sympathy or schadenfreude or indifference. Now they were watching her inclusion. Her presence. The fact that the Duke had singled her out for attention in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away. They were adjusting. She could feel it happening. Lady Ashford approached first, her earlier distance replaced by cautious warmth. Adelaide, I didn't realize you were coming. When did you arrive? Just recently. Your gown is beautiful. That color suits you perfectly. Thank you. We must talk later. I have so much to tell you about, well, about everything. We. As though they were still the friends they had been before Monday's tea. As though nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. Mrs. Dalton was next, appearing at Adelaide's elbow with practiced casualness. Miss Morland, how lovely to see you here. I was just saying to my daughter that the gathering felt incomplete, and now I see why. Adelaide smiled politely. How kind of you to say. One by one, they came. People who had maintained careful distance. People who had watched her exclusion without comment. People who had decided she was not worth the social risk of association. They came now, drawn by the Duke's public recognition, by the Duchess's warm welcome, by the undeniable fact that Adelaide was here and could no longer be ignored. They came with smiles and small talk and carefully worded comments that acknowledged her presence without acknowledging the anomaly of it. They adjusted. And as they adjusted, Adelaide felt something shift inside her. She had come here expecting humiliation. Had braced herself for stares and whispers and the cold exclusion she had experienced at Mrs. Whitmore's concert. Instead, she was being absorbed. Welcomed. Treated as though she had always been meant to be here. It was not justice. Justice would have been never being excluded in the first place. But it was something. Across the room, Adelaide caught sight of Lady Crow. She stood near the doorway to the terrace, speaking with an older gentleman Adelaide didn't recognize. But her eyes were fixed on Adelaide with an expression of barely controlled fury. Their gazes met. Held. Lady Crow's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Adelaide inclined her head fractionally, a gesture of acknowledgement, not submission. Lady Crow looked away first. Another adjustment. A small one, but significant. The evening continued around her. Dancing, conversation, laughter. The normal machinery of social gathering operating as it always did. But Adelaide moved through it differently now. Not as someone grateful for inclusion. Not as someone who had been rescued. But as someone who had been corrected back into existence by someone with the authority to do so. The Duke had not saved her. He had noticed an error and fixed it. And in fixing it, he had demonstrated something everyone in this room would now have to acknowledge. Adelaide Morland belonged here. Not because she was charming, or beautiful, or well-connected. But because someone with better judgment than Lady Crow had determined that the list was wrong. And when the Duke determined something was wrong, it got corrected. Permanently. Adelaide accepted another invitation to dance. And another. She spoke with people she had known for years as though nothing unusual had occurred. She drank champagne and listened to gossip and performed the expected social rituals with practiced ease. And beneath it all, she felt the room adjusting around her. Making space. Acknowledging her existence. Accepting what had been commanded from above. By midnight, Her exclusion had become a story no one quite remembered correctly. By 1 o'clock, it had become something that might have been a misunderstanding. By the time Adelaide finally left at 2 in the morning, climbing into the same carriage that had brought her here, it had become nothing at all. Just an anomaly. Corrected. Forgotten. As though she had always been invited. As though she had always belonged. And Adelaide, riding home through the dark streets of London, finally allowed herself to feel what she had been holding back all evening. Not gratitude. Not relief. But something closer to triumph. She had survived her exclusion with dignity, and when given the chance to return, she had walked back in with her head high. The Duke had opened the door, but Adelaide had been the one to walk through it. And that, more than anything else that had happened tonight, was something no one could take away from her. Adelaide woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the immediate, disorienting memory of the previous night. The ball. The dance. The room full of people adjusting their understanding of her in real time. For a moment, lying in bed, she let herself wonder if she had dreamed it. If she would go downstairs to find her life unchanged, her exclusion intact, the invitation nothing more than wishful thinking made manifest in sleep. Then she saw the blue silk gown draped carefully over the chair where Elizabeth had placed it after helping her undress at nearly 3 in the morning. Not a dream. Adelaide rose and dressed for the day in a simple morning gown of pale yellow. As she descended the stairs, Morrison appeared with his usual efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Morland. I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you. There are several items that arrived this morning." He gestured to the silver tray in the entrance hall. Adelaide approached slowly. The tray, which had been empty of invitations for over a week, now held 6 envelopes. 6. She picked up the first one. Lady Pemberton, inviting her to tea on Thursday. The second. Mrs. Dalton, requesting her presence at a small dinner party on Saturday. The third. An invitation to a musicale from a family she barely knew. Adelaide set them down carefully and looked at Morrison. "They all arrived this morning." "Within the last hour, miss." The messengers seemed quite insistent they be delivered promptly. "Of course they did." Adelaide carried the invitations to the drawing room and sat down to examine them properly. Each one was written with care. Each one expressed particular pleasure at the thought of her attendance. Each one suggested that her presence would be essential to the success of the gathering. Essential. A word that had not been applied to her a week ago. Adelaide set down the last invitation and looked out the window at the street below. This was the adjustment, she realized. Not the immediate recalibration at the ball, that had been shock, reaction, the scramble to align with newly demonstrated power. This was the aftermath. The slower, more deliberate process of society rewriting its understanding of who she was and where she belonged. She had been elevated. Not by her own actions, but by someone else's intervention. And now everyone was responding to that elevation as though it had been inevitable, as though they had always known she possessed whatever quality had earned the Duke's attention. The question was, what did Adelaide do with this? She could accept the invitations. Step back into social circulation with her new status. Let people pretend they had never excluded her, had never watched her humiliation with indifference or satisfaction. She could take what had been given and move forward. Or she could do something else. Adelaide sat very still, thinking. Then she pulled out writing paper and began to compose her replies. On Thursday afternoon, Adelaide attended Lady Pemberton's tea. She arrived exactly on time, dressed in a gown of soft grey that was elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was arranged simply. Her jewelry was minimal. She looked, she thought, exactly as she had looked every other time she had attended such gatherings. But everything else had changed. Lady Pemberton greeted her at the door with an enthusiasm that bordered on excessive. "Miss Morland, how wonderful that you could come. I was just telling Lady Ashford that the gathering would be incomplete without you." "How kind of you to say." Adelaide entered the drawing room to find it already full. Lady Ashford, Mrs. Dalton, Miss Cartwright and her sister, several other women she knew by sight if not by name. The conversation paused when she entered. Eyes found her, assessed her, looked away. But this time, the pause was different. This time, there was something that might have been wariness in it. Miss Morland, Lady Ashford called from her seat near the window. "Come sit with us. We were just discussing the Harrington ball. You must tell us everything." Adelaide accepted tea from Lady Pemberton and crossed to sit in the chair Lady Ashford had gestured to. "I'm not certain what there is to tell," Adelaide said pleasantly. "It was a lovely evening." "But your arrival," Mrs. Dalton pressed, leaning forward with barely concealed curiosity. "You came so late. We had all assumed, well, we weren't certain you would attend." There it was. The careful probing. The attempt to understand what had happened, to extract some explanation that would make sense of the inexplicable. Adelaide sipped her tea and considered her response. She could deflect. Could offer the same narrative the Duchess had constructed, a delayed invitation, unfortunate but not significant. Or she could do something else. "I received the invitation quite late in the evening," Adelaide said calmly. "A carriage was sent for me." "How extraordinary," Lady Pemberton murmured. "Yes," Adelaide agreed. "It was." "And the Duke," Miss Cartwright said, her voice tight. "He asked you to dance." Adelaide looked at her properly for the first time. Miss Cartwright's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something sharp beneath it. Something that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "He did," Adelaide confirmed. "How did that come about?" "He approached me and requested the dance. I accepted." "But why would he?" Miss Cartwright stopped herself. The room had gone very quiet. Adelaide set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Why would he what, Miss Cartwright?" Miss Cartwright's face colored slightly. "I only meant, it's unusual, isn't it? For the Duke to single out a particular guest that way." "Is it?" Adelaide asked. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with his usual habits at such gatherings." "Elizabeth," Miss Cartwright's sister said quietly, a warning in her tone. But Miss Cartwright didn't stop. "It's only that everyone is speculating about why you were invited so late, and why the Duke took such particular notice of you, and whether there might be some connection between those two things." The accusation hung in the air, barely disguised. "Did you arrange this somehow? Did you manipulate your way into that ball? Did you use some influence to gain the Duke's attention?" Adelaide could feel the room holding its breath, waiting to see how she would respond. She met Miss Cartwright's eyes directly. "I cannot speak to the Duke's motivations," Adelaide said clearly. "I can only tell you that I received an invitation, I attended, and I was treated with perfect courtesy by my host and fellow guests. If there is speculation about why any of that occurred, I'm afraid I cannot satisfy it. I do not presume to understand the Duke's thinking, nor do I feel any need to justify my presence at a gathering to which I was explicitly invited." Silence. Then Lady Ashford laughed, a slightly nervous sound. "Well said, Adelaide. Really, Elizabeth, what a strange thing to suggest." "I wasn't suggesting anything," Miss Cartwright said stiffly. "I was merely curious." "Curiosity is natural," Adelaide said, her tone still pleasant. "But I find that some questions are best left unasked." She picked up her teacup again and took another sip. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. The easy camaraderie that might have existed was now laced with caution. People spoke to Adelaide with careful politeness, but there was a distance in it now. They were not certain of her anymore. She had been excluded, then elevated. She had been dismissed, then recognized by someone whose recognition carried weight they couldn't ignore. And she was not grateful in the way they had expected. She was not eager to explain, to justify, to make them comfortable with what had happened. She simply was. Adelaide stayed for exactly the appropriate amount of time, then made her excuses and departed. As she climbed into her carriage, she overheard Miss Cartwright speaking to her sister just inside the door. "She's different now. Did you notice?" She's not apologetic anymore. She was never apologetic, the sister replied. Yes, but before she was at least, I don't know. Careful. Now she's just there. Like she has every right to be. Perhaps she does. Because the Duke decided she does. Does it matter why? Adelaide smiled as her carriage pulled away. Over the next week, Adelaide attended 3 more gatherings. Each time, the pattern repeated. Warm welcomes. Careful questions. The subtle probing for explanation that she consistently declined to provide. She was polite. Appropriate. Perfectly pleasant. But she offered nothing more than that. She did not explain what had happened. She did not express gratitude for being included. She did not acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. She simply attended as though she had always belonged, as though her presence required no justification. And slowly, people stopped asking. Not because they weren't curious, but because Adelaide's refusal to engage with the curiosity made it clear that no explanation would be forthcoming. On the 8th day after the ball, Adelaide received a visitor she had not expected. Lady Henrietta Crowe. Morrison announced her with carefully neutral expression, and Adelaide almost told him to say she was not receiving. But that would be cowardice. Show her in, Adelaide said. Lady Crowe entered the drawing-room with the same composed elegance she had displayed at Lady Pemberton's tea 2 weeks ago. But there was something harder in her expression now. Something that suggested this visit was not motivated by courtesy. Miss Morland, Lady Crowe said. Thank you for seeing me. Of course. Please, sit. Lady Crowe Saturday. She declined tea. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Adelaide with an expression that might have been assessment or might have been challenge. I imagine you know why I'm here, Lady Crowe said. I could speculate, Adelaide replied carefully. Then let me be direct. I wanted to apologize. Adelaide had prepared herself for many possibilities. An apology was not among them. For, she asked, for the manner in which your exclusion from the Harrington ball was communicated. It was handled poorly, and you deserved better. The words were correct. The tone was correct. But there was something underneath it, something that suggested this apology had not been Lady Crowe's idea. Thank you, Adelaide said. I appreciate your frankness. Lady Crowe inclined her head. I want you to understand that the decision was not personal. The guest list was determined by multiple factors, and sometimes difficult choices must be made. I understand. Do you? Adelaide met her eyes. I understand that decisions were made. That they were then reconsidered. Lady Crowe's jaw tightened fractionally. Yes. Reconsidered. By someone with authority to do so. Yes. They looked at each other across the small table between them. 2 women engaged in a conversation that was about power but could not be explicitly about power without violating every rule of polite discourse. I hope, Lady Crowe said carefully, that you will not hold this unfortunate situation against the Duchess. She has always valued your company. She has always valued your company. A lie, but a politically necessary one. Of course not, Adelaide said. The Duchess has been nothing but gracious. And I hope that future social occasions will proceed more smoothly. I'm certain they will. I'm glad we understand each other. Lady Crowe stood. Adelaide rose as well. At the door, Lady Crowe paused. Miss Morland, may I offer you some advice? Please. Be careful. The Duke's attention is a powerful thing. But attention can be fleeting. It would be unwise to become too reliant on it. There it was. The real message beneath the apology. You only matter because he noticed you. And if he stops noticing, you'll go back to being exactly what you were before. Adelaide smiled. Thank you for your concern, Lady Crowe. But I find that I've never been particularly reliant on anyone's attention. I've always managed quite well on my own. Lady Crowe's expression flickered, surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "Of course," she said. "Good day, Miss Morland." "Good day." After Lady Crow left, Adelaide stood by the window and watched her carriage depart. The visit had been a warning disguised as an apology. A reminder that Adelaide's elevation was contingent, precarious, dependent on forces beyond her control. But what Lady Crow didn't understand, what perhaps no one except Adelaide herself understood, was that Adelaide had never asked to be elevated in the first place. She had simply refused to be erased. And that refusal, more than any intervention by the Duke, was what had changed things. The Duke had noticed an error. But Adelaide had been the one who had survived the exclusion with her dignity intact, who had attended the ball without apology, who had danced with the Duke without gratitude, who had returned to society without explanation. The Duke had opened a door, but Adelaide had been the one to walk through it carrying herself as though she had every right to be there. And that, more than anything else, was what made her dangerous to people like Lady Crow. Not because she had been elevated, but because she refused to be grateful for it. Adelaide turned away from the window and returned to her correspondence. She had 4 more invitations to answer. And this time, when she accepted them, it would be because she chose to. Not because she needed to prove anything. Not because she owed anyone anything. But because she had decided that these gatherings were worth her time. And if people wanted to speculate about why she was there, or how she had earned her place, or what it meant that the Duke had singled her out for attention, well, they could speculate all they wanted. Adelaide Morland had no intention of explaining herself to anyone. She had spent a week doing exactly that, simply existing without justification, and she had discovered something important. When you refused to explain yourself, people eventually stopped asking. And when people stopped asking, they started accepting. Not because they understood, but because your presence became undeniable. And undeniable was all Adelaide had ever wanted to be. 3 weeks after the Harrington Ball, Adelaide attended a reception at the Austrian embassy. It was a larger gathering than most. Diplomats, politicians, members of parliament, the upper echelons of society arranged in careful clusters according to rank and influence. Adelaide had been invited by Lord Ashford, who had mentioned almost casually that the Duke would likely be in attendance. She had accepted without comment. The reception room was magnificent. High ceilings, gilt moulding, crystal chandeliers that scattered light like scattered diamonds. Adelaide moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had learned, over the past 3 weeks, that presence was its own form of authority. She no longer questioned whether she belonged in these spaces. She simply occupied them. Lady Ashford found her near the champagne table. "Adelaide, there you are. I was hoping we might. Oh, there's Mrs. Pemberton. I promised I'd speak with her about the charity auction. Will you excuse me?" "Of course." Lady Ashford hurried off, and Adelaide found herself momentarily alone in the crowd. She didn't mind. Solitude in public spaces no longer felt like exclusion. It felt like choice. "Miss Morland." The voice came from behind her. Deep, measured, unmistakable. Adelaide turned to find Duke Sebastian Langford standing at a polite distance, his expression as analytically neutral as it had been when they danced 3 weeks ago. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy. He inclined his head. "I trust the evening finds you well." "Very well, thank you." A pause. Around them, conversations continued, but Adelaide was aware, as she suspected Sebastian was also aware, that multiple people were watching this interaction with poorly concealed interest. They had not spoken since the ball. She had seen him at 2 other gatherings, always across crowded rooms, always engaged in conversations with people far more important than herself. He had acknowledged her presence with brief nods, nothing more. This was the first time he had approached her directly. "I wanted to inquire," Sebastian said, "whether the subsequent weeks have been manageable." Adelaide considered the question. It was carefully worded. Not pleasant or successful, but manageable. As though he understood that the aftermath of his intervention would be complex rather than simply positive. "They have been educational," Adelaide replied. Something that might have been amusement touched his eyes. Educational. I have learned a great deal about how quickly consensus can be reconstructed when authority indicates a preference. And has that education been valuable? Extremely. Sebastian picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray and held it without drinking. I've heard reports that you've been handling yourself with considerable composure. Reports, Adelaide repeated. One hears things. And what have you heard, Your Grace? That you attended Lady Pemberton's tea and declined to explain yourself. That you've accepted invitations without expressing particular gratitude. That Lady Crow called on you and left looking considerably less certain of herself than when she arrived. Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else, she couldn't identify. You've been keeping track. I correct errors, Sebastian said mildly. It's prudent to monitor whether the correction holds. And does it hold? He looked at her properly then, his grey eyes assessing. Yes. Though not in the way I expected. How did you expect it to hold? I expected you would be absorbed back into society with minimal disruption. That the initial shock would fade and life would proceed as though nothing had changed. But you've made certain that something has changed. Adelaide met his gaze. I didn't do anything. Precisely. She frowned. I don't understand. Sebastian took a sip of his champagne, the first time she'd seen him actually drink it, and seemed to consider his words carefully. Most people, when elevated by external intervention, respond with either excessive gratitude or excessive pride. They either perform humility to show they're worthy of the elevation, or they perform superiority to suggest they deserved it all along. Both responses reinforce the narrative that their position changed because someone else changed it. And I did neither. No. You simply continued. You attended gatherings as though your presence required no justification. You declined to explain the circumstances of your exclusion or your subsequent inclusion. You treated the entire situation as though it were beneath comment. Should I have done otherwise? Not at all. What you did was considerably more effective than anything I anticipated. Adelaide felt something tighten in her chest. I wasn't trying to be effective. I know. That's what made it effective. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the reception continued its elaborate dance of diplomacy and social positioning. Finally, Adelaide said quietly, Why did you do it? I told you. The list was wrong. But why did you care that it was wrong? Sebastian looked at her with that same analytical attention he'd displayed at the ball. Because errors offend me. Because people like Lady Crow make decisions based on preference and call it judgment. Because you had done nothing to warrant exclusion except fail to be remarkable enough to be automatically included, which is not actually a failing at all. That's very rational. I am generally rational. Is that the only reason? The question surprised them both. Adelaide hadn't intended to ask it, and Sebastian's expression suggested he hadn't expected to be asked. No, he admitted after a pause. It's not. What was the other reason? Sebastian set down his champagne glass on a nearby table. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, meant only for her. Because I have spent most of my life watching people with power use it carelessly. Watching them exclude and include based on whim, watching them destroy reputations with a word and elevate mediocrity with a nod. Watching them treat other human beings as pieces to be moved around a board according to rules that benefit only themselves. He stopped, seeming to catch himself. And when I saw your name missing from that list, and saw the names that were included instead, I realized I had a choice. I could observe the injustice with detachment, as I have observed countless others, or I could do something about it. The fact that it was within my power to correct made inaction feel like complicity. Adelaide stared at him. That's not rational at all. No, Sebastian agreed. It's not. It's moral. Perhaps. You intervened because you thought it was right. I intervened because I thought the list was wrong. Whether that's the same thing is a philosophical question I'm not equipped to answer. Adelaide felt something shift in her understanding of this man. She had thought of him as analytical, detached, someone who corrected errors with the emotional investment of a mathematician fixing a proof. But there was something else beneath that. Something that cared about justice even when admitting to caring about it made him uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said quietly. Sebastian's eyes sharpened. "I told you not to thank me. You told me not to thank you for correcting an error. I'm not thanking you for that. Then what are you thanking me for? For caring that the error existed in the first place." Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with something that might have been respect, "You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for. You didn't give me credit for anything. You simply noticed I was missing. Which is its own form of credit." A gentleman approached them, someone Adelaide recognized as a member of Parliament. He greeted Sebastian with the easy familiarity of political allies and drew him into a conversation about upcoming legislation. Sebastian glanced at Adelaide briefly, an acknowledgement that their conversation was being interrupted, before turning his attention to the newcomer. Adelaide stepped away, giving them privacy. As she moved through the crowd, she found herself thinking about what Sebastian had said. "I could observe the injustice with detachment, or I could do something about it." He had chosen to do something. Not because it benefited him. Not because it was politically advantageous. But because he had the power to correct something he perceived as wrong and chose to use that power. It was, Adelaide realized, the most privileged could hope to be, aware of itself and willing to be useful. The rest of the evening proceeded smoothly. Adelaide spoke with several acquaintances, was introduced to a visiting diplomat's wife, and managed to avoid Miss Cartwright entirely by positioning herself on the opposite side of the room whenever they seemed likely to intersect. At 11 o'clock, she made her excuses and prepared to leave. As she waited for her carriage to be brought around, she found Sebastian standing near the entrance, also apparently departing. "Miss Morland," he said, "may I offer you a ride? I'm heading west, if that's convenient." Adelaide hesitated. Accepting would create a new association, would give the gossips fresh material, would bind her to him in ways she hadn't yet decided she wanted to be bound. But refusing would be cowardice. And Adelaide had decided, over the past 3 weeks, that she was done with cowardice. "That would be convenient, thank you." Sebastian's carriage was as impressive as Adelaide had expected. Dark leather, polished wood, the ducal crest emblazoned on the door. A footman handed her inside, and Sebastian followed, settling into the seat opposite her. The carriage rolled forward into the night. For several minutes, neither spoke. Adelaide watched London pass by the window, familiar streets made strange by darkness and lamplight. "I have a question," Sebastian said finally. "Yes." "Why didn't you leave?" Adelaide looked at him. "Leave? London? After the exclusion? You could have visited family in the country, taken your letter to Bath, disappeared until the scandal faded. You know about the letter to Bath. I know you intended to leave. And then you didn't." Adelaide considered lying, offering some practical reason why her plans had changed. But she found she didn't want to lie to this man who had asked direct questions and deserved direct answers. "Because leaving would have looked like retreat," she said. "And I was tired of being invisible." "So you stayed to be visible." "I stayed because I realized that my dignity didn't require anyone's permission. That I could simply exist in spaces I'd been told I didn't belong and dare anyone to tell me otherwise." Sebastian nodded slowly. "And then I interfered." "Yes." "Do you resent that?" Adelaide thought about it. Did she resent having her agency superseded, her carefully constructed plan to simply endure replaced by someone else's intervention? "No," she said finally. "I resent that the intervention was necessary. But I don't resent that you made it." That's a careful distinction. It's an important one. The carriage slowed, pulling up in front of Adelaide's townhouse. Sebastian leaned forward slightly. "Miss Morland, I want to be clear about something." "Yes." "What I did, correcting the guest list, that was the extent of my intervention. I have no intention of managing your social calendar or monitoring your acceptance in society. You were correct when you said I simply opened a door. What you do beyond that threshold is entirely your concern." "I understand. I'm not certain you do." Sebastian's expression was serious now. "People will assume there is some connection between us beyond what actually exists. They will assume my interest is personal rather than correctional. You should be prepared for that speculation." "And what is your interest, Your Grace? For the sake of clarity." Sebastian met her eyes directly. "Professional courtesy. I corrected an error. I've ensured the correction holds. Beyond that, you are free to succeed or fail on your own merits." It should have stung. Should have felt like dismissal. Instead, it felt like respect. "Thank you for the clarity," Adelaide said. "You're welcome." The footman opened the door. Adelaide prepared to descend, then paused. "Your Grace." "Yes." "If you encounter another error in the future, another exclusion that offends your sense of order, I hope you'll correct that one too." Sebastian's expression shifted, surprise, perhaps, or something close to it. "You think there will be others?" "I think people like Lady Crow exist in abundance. And I think errors accumulate when left uncorrected." "You're suggesting I make a habit of this?" "I'm suggesting that having the power to correct errors creates an obligation to use it. But perhaps that's presumptuous of me." "It's not presumptuous," Sebastian said slowly. "It's interesting." Interesting. Most people, when given advantage by power, want to ensure that advantage remains exclusive. You're suggesting I distribute it more widely. "I'm suggesting that justice shouldn't be accidental." They looked at each other across the dim interior of the carriage. Then Sebastian smiled, a real smile, not the polite social version but something genuine. "You've given me something to consider, Miss Morland." "I'm glad." Adelaide descended from the carriage. As she climbed the steps to her door, she heard Sebastian call after her. "Miss Morland." She turned. "Yes." "You were never invisible. You were simply unseen. Those are different things." Before Adelaide could respond, the carriage rolled away, disappearing into the London night. Adelaide stood on her doorstep for a moment, watching it go. "You were never invisible. You were simply unseen." She turned and entered her house, Morrison closing the door quietly behind her. Upstairs, in her bedroom, Adelaide prepared for bed with Elizabeth's help. As she sat at her vanity while Elizabeth unpinned her hair, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked the same as she had 3 weeks ago. Same face, same features, same person. But something had shifted that wasn't visible in reflection. 3 weeks ago, she had been someone who accepted exclusion because she believed she had no other choice. Now she was someone who understood that exclusion was a construct, maintained by consensus, vulnerable to correction by anyone with sufficient authority or sufficient refusal to accept it. The Duke had corrected her exclusion. But Adelaide had learned something more valuable, that visibility was not granted by others but claimed by oneself. That dignity did not require permission. That sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to disappear. She had been excluded. She had been corrected back into existence. But in the space between those two states, she had discovered something about power that she hadn't known before. Real power, the kind that lasted, wasn't given by others. It was the power to define yourself, to occupy space without apology, to exist on your own terms regardless of who tried to tell you otherwise. The Duke had opened a door. But Adelaide had learned how to walk through any door she chose. And that knowledge was worth more than any invitation to any ball could ever be. Elizabeth finished with her hair. Adelaide thanked her and dismissed her for the evening. Then she sat alone in her bedroom, looking at her reflection, and smiled. Tomorrow, there would be more gatherings, more invitations, more careful negotiations of social territory. But Adelaide Morland would attend them as herself, not as someone grateful for inclusion, not as someone dependent on anyone's recognition, but as someone who had learned that the only permission she needed to exist was her own, and that, more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 weeks, was a form of power no one could take away. The Duke had corrected an error, but Adelaide had corrected something more fundamental. She had corrected her understanding of her own worth. And that correction, unlike the Duke's, was permanent. Some loves are never spoken of. Others are remembered. Tonight, no speeches were made. No apologies offered. A single line was removed. Another written in its place. And everything that followed, simply obeyed. If you stayed to witness that moment, if you understand why silence carried more weight than words, then you already belong here. Subscribe. Remain.